The mashed potatoes felt like concrete in my mouth as I stared across the dining room table at my family. The familiar scent of turkey and cranberry sauce that usually brought comfort now seemed suffocating in the thick silence that had settled over our Thanksgiving dinner. My Aunt Michelle's words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable echoing in my mind with devastating clarity. "We've all agreed to cut you off." The fork trembled in my hand as I tried to process what I'd just heard. This wasn't how family dinners were supposed to go. This wasn't how families were supposed to work. I could feel every pair of eyes boring into me from around the table, their gazes heavy with judgment and finality. My brother Paul sat directly across from me, his expression unreadable as he methodically cut his turkey into perfect squares. The same Paul who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms when we were kids, who taught me how to ride a bike in this very driveway. Now, he wouldn't even look at me directly. His attention focused entirely on his plate, as if I'd already ceased to exist. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could have, slicing through years of shared memories and sibling bonds. Michelle cleared her throat, the sound sharp and authoritative in the oppressive quiet. She'd always been the family spokesperson, the one who organized holidays and mediated disputes, but tonight she felt more like a judge delivering a verdict. "This decision wasn't made lightly, Donna," she continued, her voice steady but cold. "We've talked about this extensively, and we all feel it's what's best for the family moving forward." Her words were carefully chosen, rehearsed even, as if she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. I wondered how long they'd been planning this moment, how many secret conversations had taken place behind my back. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking each second of my humiliation with mechanical precision. I tried to find my voice, to ask what I'd done wrong, but the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. My father Andrew sat at the head of the table, the same spot he'd occupied for every holiday meal I could remember, but he might as well have been a stranger. His eyes were fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, refusing to acknowledge my presence or the devastation written across my face. The man who used to call me his little princess now treated me like a ghost haunting his dinner table. "What did I do?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible above the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The question felt pathetic even as it left my lips, but I needed to understand. I needed someone to explain how I'd gone from beloved daughter and sister to family pariah without any warning or explanation. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china, as everyone else continued eating as if nothing had happened, as if my entire world hadn't just crumbled into dust around me. Paul finally looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment before darting away again. There was something there, something that looked almost like guilt, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You know what you did," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual warmth and humor. But I didn't know. That was the most terrifying part of this entire nightmare. I genuinely had no idea what crime I'd supposedly committed against my own family. The confusion mixed with hurt and anger, creating a toxic cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me completely. I pushed my chair back from the table, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Standing felt like moving through quicksand, every muscle in my body heavy with shock and disbelief. "I don't understand any of this," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You're my family. You can't just decide I don't exist anymore." But even as I spoke the words, I could see in their faces that they absolutely could and already had. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had already written me out of their story. The walk to the front door felt like a funeral march, each step taking me further away from the only family I'd ever known. Behind me, I could hear the quiet murmur of conversation resuming, as if my departure had lifted some invisible weight from the room. My coat hung on the same hook it had occupied since childhood, next to Paul's old varsity jacket and my father's work coat. For a moment, I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, hoping someone would call out to me, would tell me this was all some terrible mistake. But the only sound was the continued clink of silverware and the low hum of normal family conversation, a conversation I was no longer welcome to join. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and tears, the familiar streets of Denver looking foreign and hostile in the darkness. I kept replaying Michelle's words in my mind, searching for some clue I might have missed, some explanation for this sudden exile from my own family. The radio played soft jazz, the same station my mother used to listen to while cooking dinner, and I had to turn it off before the memories became too painful to bear. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in like poison through my veins. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I finally made it home, the walls seeming to close in around me as I collapsed onto my couch. The silence was different here, not the oppressive quiet of judgment, but the hollow emptiness of isolation. I stared at my phone, thumb hovering over Paul's contact information, desperate to call him and demand answers. We'd always been close, despite our 3-year age difference, and he'd been my confidant through every major crisis in my life. The thought that he could sit there and watch me be destroyed without saying a word felt like a betrayal beyond comprehension. The apartment was filled with reminders of my family, photos from last Christmas, a quilt my grandmother had made, birthday cards from years past. Each item felt like evidence of a life that had apparently been built on lies, relationships that could be severed without warning or explanation. I picked up a framed photo from my college graduation, all of us smiling and proud, Paul's arm around my shoulders as he whispered some joke that had made me laugh just as the camera clicked. That person in the photo felt like a stranger now, someone naive enough to believe that family bonds were unbreakable. Sleep was impossible that night, my mind racing through every family interaction from the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. Had there been tension I'd been too blind to see? Conversations that stopped when I entered a room? I replayed every phone call, every text message, every casual encounter, but nothing stood out as unusual. If anything, things had seemed normal, better than normal, even. Paul had been texting me regularly, sharing memes and asking about my work. Michelle had invited me to Thanksgiving herself, seeming genuinely excited about the family gathering. The next morning brought no relief, only the harsh reality of sunlight streaming through my blinds and illuminating the wreckage of my life. I called in sick to work, unable to imagine facing my colleagues' questions about how my holiday had gone. The thought of pretending everything was fine, of making small talk about turkey and football, felt impossible. Instead, I sat in my pajamas, staring at my phone and trying to work up the courage to call someone, anyone, who might be able to explain what had happened to my family. I started with my cousin Sarah, Michelle's daughter, who had always been like a sister to me. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, and I hung up without leaving a message. Next, I tried my Uncle Robert, Michelle's husband, but got the same result. It was as if the entire family had coordinated their silence, creating an impenetrable wall between me and any hope of understanding. The isolation felt deliberate and cruel, designed to maximize my confusion and pain. By afternoon, desperation had replaced shock, and I found myself driving back to my childhood neighborhood. I parked across the street from my father's house, the same house where I'd learned to walk and talk, where I'd brought home report cards and prom dates. The windows glowed warmly in the fading daylight, and I could see shadows moving inside, my family going about their lives as if I'd never existed. The normalcy of it all was perhaps the most painful part, the realization that my absence hadn't created even a ripple in their daily routine. I sat in my car for over an hour, hoping to catch a glimpse of Paul or my father, hoping for some sign that someone missed me or regretted what had happened. But the house remained a fortress of indifference, its warm lights mocking my exile. As darkness fell, I finally drove away, the weight of my new reality settling over me like a shroud. I was truly alone now, cut off from the people who had shaped my entire identity. The question that haunted me as I drove through the empty streets was simple but devastating. How do you rebuild a life when the foundation has been ripped away without warning? The days that followed blurred together in a haze of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, staying late at the office and volunteering for every project that came my way. My colleagues noticed the change, but attributed it to post-holiday motivation, never suspecting that I was simply trying to outrun the crushing weight of my family's rejection. The mundane tasks of my job as a marketing coordinator felt like lifelines, small anchors of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. But even work couldn't completely distract me from the growing obsession with understanding what had gone wrong. I found myself analyzing every family gathering from the past year, every conversation, every seemingly innocent comment. Had my political views offended someone? Had I said something inappropriate at my cousin's wedding? The possibilities swirled through my mind like a tornado, each theory more devastating than the last. I made lists, actual written lists, of potential offenses, trying to solve the mystery of my own exile like some twisted detective story. The worst part was the silence from Paul. We had texted almost daily for years, sharing everything from work frustrations to funny videos we found online. Our last conversation had been just 2 days before Thanksgiving, a casual exchange about whether he should bring wine or dessert to dinner. There had been no hint of anger, no suggestion that anything was wrong between us. Now his silence felt like a physical presence, a void where my brother used to be that grew larger and more painful with each passing day. I started checking social media obsessively, scrolling through my family members' posts for any clue about their decision. Michelle had posted photos from Thanksgiving dinner, the same dinner where I'd been excommunicated, showing everyone smiling and laughing around the table. My absence wasn't even noticeable in the carefully cropped images, as if I'd been digitally erased from the family narrative. The comments were full of heart emojis and "looks delicious," responses from friends who had no idea they were looking at the scene of my destruction. Sleep became my enemy, bringing dreams where everything was normal again, where Paul and I were kids building snow forts in the backyard, where my father was teaching me to drive in the empty parking lot behind his office. I would wake up reaching for my phone to text Paul about some silly dream, only to remember that he was no longer part of my life. The mornings were the cruelest time. Those first few seconds of consciousness before reality crashed back down like a wave, drowning me in fresh grief all over again. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I finally worked up the courage to drive by Paul's apartment complex. I didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to see him, to look into his eyes and demand an explanation for this nightmare. His car was in its usual spot, and I could see lights on in his second-floor window. For 30 minutes, I sat in my car, rehearsing what I would say, how I would approach him. But every scenario ended the same way, with him turning away from me, with doors closing in my face, with the confirmation that I was truly unwanted. I never got out of the car that day, but something shifted inside me as I sat there watching his window. The passive acceptance that had characterized my first 2 weeks of exile began to transform into something harder, more determined. I deserved answers, even if my family didn't think I deserved their love. I had spent 28 years as a daughter, a sister, a niece, and those relationships couldn't just be erased without explanation. If they wanted me gone, they owed me the courtesy of telling me why. The drive home that evening felt different, charged with a new sense of purpose. I was done being a victim of circumstances I didn't understand. I was done accepting this exile without a fight. Whatever I had supposedly done, whatever crime had been so heinous that it warranted complete banishment from my own family, I was going to find out. And if it turned out to be based on lies or misunderstandings, if this whole nightmare was built on false foundations, then I was going to tear it down brick by brick until the truth was exposed. My family might have written me off, but I wasn't ready to write them off just yet. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, in the most unexpected way possible. I was cleaning out my email inbox, deleting the usual spam and promotional messages, when I noticed something odd. There was an email thread between Paul and Michelle that had somehow been forwarded to me, probably by accident when Paul was trying to send it to someone else. My heart stopped as I read the subject line, "Donna situation, final decision." The timestamp showed it was sent 2 days before Thanksgiving, which meant they had been planning my exile while I was picking out what dress to wear to dinner. My hands trembled as I opened the email, afraid of what I might find, but unable to stop myself from reading. The thread was extensive, going back nearly 2 months, and as I scrolled through the messages, a picture began to emerge that was far worse than anything I had imagined. Paul hadn't just been a passive participant in my banishment, he had been the architect of it. Email after email showed him carefully building a case against me, sharing concerns about my behavior, my attitude, my supposed disrespect for family values. The lies were so detailed, so convincing, that I almost believed them myself for a moment. According to Paul's emails, I had been bad-mouthing our father to mutual friends, calling him a failure and embarrassment. I had supposedly made cruel comments about Michelle's weight at a family barbecue over the summer. Most devastating of all, he claimed I had told him I was only staying close to the family because I expected to inherit money when our father died. Each accusation was a masterpiece of manipulation, containing just enough truth to be believable while being completely fabricated. I read through the entire thread 3 times, my disbelief growing with each pass. Michelle's responses showed how effectively Paul had poisoned her against me, her initial skepticism gradually giving way to anger and disappointment. "I never would have expected this from Donna," she wrote in one message. "She always seemed so sweet and caring." By the end of the thread, she was the one suggesting the complete cutoff, convinced that I was a toxic presence who needed to be removed from the family for everyone's good. The most chilling part was how calculated it all seemed. Paul had been methodical in his destruction of my reputation, spacing out his revelations over weeks to make them seem more credible. He had anticipated questions and prepared answers, creating a narrative so compelling that even I might have believed it if I hadn't known it was false. The brother I had trusted with my deepest secrets, who had been my closest confidant for nearly 3 decades, had systematically destroyed my life with the precision of a surgeon. But why? That question burned through me as I printed out the entire email thread, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. What could I have possibly done to make Paul hate me enough to orchestrate such an elaborate betrayal? We had always been competitive as kids, but I thought we had outgrown that years ago. We had supported each other through college, through breakups, through career changes. I had been the first person he called when he got his promotion last year, and he had helped me move into my current apartment. As I sat surrounded by printed emails, the full scope of Paul's betrayal became clear. This wasn't a moment of anger or a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. This was a deliberate, sustained campaign to destroy my relationship with our family, carried out by the person I trusted most in the world. The Paul I thought I knew, funny, loyal, protective, had never really existed. The real Paul was capable of cruelty I couldn't have imagined, willing to sacrifice his own sister for reasons I still couldn't fathom. The worst part was realizing how alone I had been throughout this entire ordeal. While I was desperately trying to understand what I had done wrong, while I was torturing myself with guilt and confusion, Paul had been watching my pain with the satisfaction of a job well done. Every unanswered text, every ignored phone call, every sleepless night had been exactly what he wanted. He hadn't just taken my family away from me. He had enjoyed watching me suffer in the aftermath. The brother I had loved unconditionally had become my worst enemy, and I had never seen it coming. Armed with the devastating truth of Paul's betrayal, I knew I couldn't let this stand. The evidence was overwhelming, dozens of emails proving his systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and turn our family against me. I spent the entire weekend crafting my response, not just to Paul, but to everyone who had participated in my exile. I wasn't going to slink away quietly like some guilty party. I was going to fight back with everything I had. The scared, confused woman who had stumbled out of that Thanksgiving dinner was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who refused to be a victim of her brother's lies any longer. I started with Michelle, forwarding her the entire email thread along with a carefully worded message explaining how she had been manipulated. "You've known me for 28 years, I wrote. "Does any of this sound like something I would actually do or say?" I could picture her reading it, the slow dawning of realization that she had been played, that her beloved nephew had used her love for the family as a weapon against me. Within hours, my phone was ringing with her number, but I let it go to voicemail. She could stew in her guilt for a while, just like I had stewed in my confusion and pain for weeks. The confrontation with Paul was inevitable, and I wanted it to be on my terms. I drove to his apartment complex on a Tuesday evening, knowing he would be home from work, but before he usually went out with friends. This time, I didn't hesitate in the parking lot. I marched up to his door and pounded on it with a fury that surprised even me. When he opened it, the look of shock on his face was almost worth the weeks of agony he had put me through. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past him into the apartment where we had shared so many good memories before I knew what kind of person he really was. "Donna, what are you doing here?" he stammered, but I could see the guilt written all over his face. He knew exactly why I was there, knew that his carefully constructed house of lies had finally collapsed. I threw the printed emails on his coffee table, watching as his face went pale when he recognized his own words. "Did you really think I would never find out?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "Did you think you could destroy my life and I would just disappear quietly?" For the first time in our entire relationship, Paul looked afraid of me, and I realized that fear was exactly what he deserved. The truth came out in fragments, each admission more pathetic than the last. He was jealous of my relationship with our father, resentful that I had been the good kid while he struggled with addiction and job instability in his 20s. He convinced himself that I was the favorite, that I was somehow stealing the love and attention that should have been his. The family exile wasn't just about hurting me. It was about positioning himself as the loyal son, the one who had protected the family from my supposed toxicity. As I listened to his justifications, I realized that the brother I had mourned was truly dead, replaced by this bitter, manipulative stranger who had been willing to destroy me to make himself feel better. But I had survived his worst, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of what he had done.